Hello everyone, my name is Zenitsu and I'm back with another Digimon deck profile video. So today I'm going to be exploring BT04, and in BT04 we have some new and powerful tools to make some new and powerful and interesting decks. One of these decks is going to be the Mirage Gaugamon deck, and Mirage Gaugamon is a pretty decent card just because a lot of his support already synergizes very nicely with a lot of what Blue is currently already doing, so you could utilize a whole bunch of various tools to really make it a decently strong Mirage Gaugamon deck. But this is just the base deck that I settled with, and I definitely think it's a really fun and interesting deck. So, going over the deck, starting with the Digitama, I'm going to be running 4 copies of Upamon. So Upamon is still the best generically decent Digitama that we have access to, just because he has this really nice ability where when attacking once per turn, if the opponent has a Digimon with no Digivolution sources in it, then you get to draw 1 card. So even though in this deck we're not really forcing the opponent to have a Digimon with no Digivolution sources, it's just the fact that this ability tends to come up more often than it doesn't, so it's still a really good way of drawing cards for the deck. And then the other Digitama of the deck is going to be 1 copy of DemiVeemon. So this is the BT02 version of DemiVeemon, and he has some really nice interactions with the deck because we do have a little bit of unsuspend synergy. So the fact that we have this version of DemiVeemon to capitalize on the unsuspend synergy just makes it a really good Digitama to choose from. But this slot could really be any other Digitama you feel like utilizing. I'm just preferring to go with the DP boost that this version of DemiVeemon provides. Next, on to the rookies, I'm going to be running 4 copies of Veemon. So this Veemon is still a really strong Digimon to be playing around with just because he has the native ability of jamming. So having an early game jammer means that you could apply some early game aggression onto the opponent, and that's just really powerful to think about doing just because a lot of the blue megas or our win conditions tend to want to utilize and capitalize on the fact that we want to deal as much damage as early as possible, so that way we can have some very powerful plays to close out the game with, and there's no better aggro card currently in blue than this version of Veemon right here. Next, I'm going to be running 4 copies of Gaomon. So Gaomon is a pretty decent Digimon just because he has a really nice inheritable ability where during your turn, when this Digimon is basically pitched due to the effect of a Digiburst ability, then this card goes to your hand instead of the trash. So this is just really good just because basically just always making sure that you're going to have a rookie in hand is really nice, especially since our rookie count is a little bit on the lower side in this style of deck, but we could compensate for the fact that we don't have as many rookies because Gaomon will add himself back to the hand when we use our Digiburst abilities. And then the last rookie of the deck could really be anything you feel like you want to be utilizing. I'm just going to be going with the tried and true classic Gorillamon because this Gorillamon is just the value efficient vanilla of the deck where you know the drill. Low play cost, low evo cost, decent DP means that he's still a very decent card to be running. Next, on to the champions, I'm going to be running 4 copies of Gorillamon. So Gorillamon is really only in here just because he is a very powerful and very efficient tempo tool, where his low evo cost compared to a lot of other Digimon in his level just make it that much easier to Digivolve up into him, and then the fact that we Digivolved up into him relatively cheaply means that we could Digivolve up past him relatively efficiently as well. So that's just one big aspect to why we're playing this card is just for the fact that he has a low evo cost, but on top of the fact that he also has a low evo cost, he also has some relatively decent DP in case we feel like we need to aggress it with the card early on. Next, I'm going to be running 4 copies of Lobomon. So Lobomon is a pretty interesting Digimon to be running in this style of deck just because we are going to be playing some Tamers, and Lobomon is still just a very powerful Digimon to be playing around with just because he has this very nice ability where you could Digivolve him off of a blue Tamer as if it was a level 3 Digimon. So this is really powerful of a ability to have just because right now the opponent doesn't have much interaction with your Tamers, so you could just be sitting on a field of Tamers, and Lobomon is a great way of utilizing all of your dead Tamers, so that way you could turn them into a Digimon and then continue the aggression that way. And then lastly, I'm going to be running 4 copies of Grizzlymon. Grizzlymon is still just the deck's dedicated blocker, and I feel like this isn't necessarily the fastest deck where we could afford not to play a blocker, so still having a blocker is very important, especially against certain matchups. You just want to make sure you have some form of defense. Next, onto the ultimates, I'm going to be running 4 copies of Monzaemon. So Monzaemon is still a very fantastic Digimon just because of how efficient this Digimon also is. So this Digimon is really efficient just because compared to a lot of other Digimon in his level, he has a very low play cost. So if we ever see a hand where we don't have a rookie, then we don't feel as bad at just hard playing a Monzaemon, because then we could threaten to go into our Megas, and that's still just very, very powerful. But not only does he have a very low play cost compared to a lot of other Digimon in his level, he also has a really low Evo cost, so that way if we need to use him as a cheap way to just help Evo us up very efficiently into our Megas, then he's also really good for that as well. And then the last ultimate of the deck is going to be 4 copies of Mirage Gaugamon. So Mirage Gaugamon is a very powerful new addition to blue, and I think this card is actually just a really decent ultimate to be running overall, just because of all of the abilities that this card has. So the first big ability that he has is a main ability of Digiburst 2. So you discard 2 of your Digivolution sources, and then the ability you gain for doing that is you get to bounce one of the opponent's level 4 or less Digimon back to their hand, and then all of those evolutions are discarded. So blue doesn't really have a whole lot of really good removal effects, so the fact that we have a ultimate that could help remove the opponent's Digimon is just really, really powerful, especially since most of the blockers are going to be on level 4s, so you could utilize this ability to just bounce a blocker back to the opponent's hand, and then you're free to aggress it after Digivolving or free to aggress with this card. So just his Digiburst ability alone is already very strong, but he even has another really good inherentable effect, where during your turn, if you have a tamer in play, this doesn't specify blue, so that's really important to note. But while you have a tamer in play, this Digimon gets plus 2000 DP. So blue doesn't really have the most efficient ways of DP boosting their Digimon, so the fact that Mirage Gaugamon has a very easy condition to DP boost your Digimon is just absolutely fantastic. So between his inheritable and his Digiburst ability, they're both very, very strong effects that just make this card worth running. Next, on to the Megas, I'm going to be running 3 copies of Gorillamon. So Gorillamon is a pretty decent Digimon because he has the really powerful Digiburst ability. The condition to trigger the Digiburst ability is when Digivolve, so keep that in mind. But the fact that he has a really nice when Digiburst ability of allowing you to bounce one of your opponent's level 5 or lower Digimon back to their hand is still really, really powerful because, like I said before, blue doesn't really have the best removal cards, so any bit of removal that they could get on their Digimon is always welcome, and on top of which, because he does have the Digiburst ability, we could utilize another card with Digiburst to add Gaomon back to our hand if he's in Gorillammon's evolution source when you use the Digiburst ability. So Gorillamon, not only having the Gorillamon name, a removal type effect, and interacts with Digiburst, he's also a really decent beater of a Digimon just because he also has 12,000 DP, all making him a very good Digimon to want to run. And then the last Mega of the deck is going to be 4 copies of Mirage Gaugamon. So Mirage Gaugamon is just a pretty generically decent Digimon in his own right, and he has his own little built-in support package that really likes to support him, but like I said earlier, his support package and Mirage Gaugamon is just so generically decent that you could splash this package in with a whole bunch of other various strategies that Blue has been playing around with and feel pretty good about it just because they are just generically complementing each other. So what Mirage Gaugamon is doing that's making him pretty decent is the fact that he has a really nice when Digivolving ability where you get to gain 1 memory for every 4 cards in your opponent's hand. So if your opponent has 8 cards in their hand, then you'll be gaining 2, which basically means he's reducing his evolution by 2. Not really, because you're gaining the memory. So cards that shut off memory gain do stop this ability. But regardless, the fact that he can be just a very efficient Digimon to Digivolve into is always really, really nice. And then on top of the fact that he makes his evolution cheaper, he also has the added power of making himself unblockable during your turn. So having an unblockable Digimon just incentivizes that we want to break as much security as early as we possibly can, so that way when we go into Mirage Gaugamon, we could utilize his unblockable ability to just try to close out the game that much more faster and that much more efficiently, just because we don't have to dance around blockers. Next, on to the options, I'm going to be running 2 copies of the Ray of Victory. So this could really be any other 2 cards that you feel like you wanted to utilize, but I just felt like for what the deck is trying to do, the Ray of Victory is still a pretty decent card that synergizes with the deck quite nicely. So what this card is doing is it has the main ability of allowing you to bounce one of the opponent's level 5 or lower Digimon back to their hand, and then if you have a blue Tamer in play, then we get to unsuspend one of our Digimon. So both of those effects are very powerful, and our deck kind of is playing around with those effects a little bit to where we could really make the most of it, because the whole idea behind a lot of the bounce effects is actually supporting the fact that Mirage Gaugamon wants the opponent to have a whole bunch of cards in their hand, so that way he could reduce his memory even further. So the whole idea behind these bounce effects is that is the way we're adding cards back to the opponent's hand, so that way we can make Mirage Gaugamon that much more efficient to play. And then on top of which, it also has a really nice security ability of allowing us to activate its main effect. So if it's checked in the security, then we get to use both effects. And the unsuspend a Digimon on our field is pretty interesting of an ability to have on the opponent's turn, because if we block with a blocker and then that card is checked in the security, we could use its effect to stand up the blocker, or if they're trying to go into our rested Digimon, then we could utilize that ability during the opponent's turn to just stand up our Digimon so that way they can't be attacked into. So it's a relatively flexible ability to have that can be utilized in different ways depending on when and how we use this card, or when and how we see this card. But like I said before, this card could really be any other 2 cards you feel like you wanted to run. I just felt like the Ray of Victory was a pretty spicy card. And then the last option of the deck is going to be 4 copies of Hammer Spark. So Hammer Spark is still a very powerful and very important option just because of how much this card can do. So its main ability is just being able to gain us a memory for free, which is still just very, very powerful because it allows us to extend some of our plays and make some more powerful plays possible where they might not have been before. So just being able to gain that 1 memory is still super important. And then it has the nice powerful security ability of being able to gain 2 memory, which it's effectively taking 2 memory away from the opponent, and sometimes that could force end the opponent's turn, and that could be really, really brutal on the opponent. So Hammer Spark is still just a very important card to be running overall. And then lastly, onto the Tamers, I'm going to be running 3 copies of Davis. So Davis is still one of the best, most generic Tamers that we have access to that's doing quite a lot for the deck. So the first big thing that he's doing is he is the memory fixing tamer of the deck. So if our memory is ever less than 3, he'll always just hard set it to 3. And this is really important because it allows us to make as many powerful plays as we possibly can, and play our cards as efficiently as we possibly can, and prevent the opponent from memory starving us. So that's already just a huge aspect to why we already want to run the card. But on top of that, he also has a really nice on-play effect where we get to check the top 3 cards of our deck and add 1 blue and 1 green Digimon among them into our hand, then the rest go to the bottom. Well, we're not really going to be running any green Digimon in the deck, so we're always going to be at least able to add a blue Digimon, and that's still just pretty decent considering a tamer that just memory fixes us and helps us dig for our cards are all very good things to have. And then the last card of the deck and the last tamer of the deck is going to be 2 copies of Thomas. So Thomas is a pretty interesting tamer because he really only synergizes with Gaomon, so this is the only time you're ever really going to be able to utilize a card like this. So he has 2 abilities. His first ability is he has a good on-play ability where we get to just draw a card. So that's already pretty decent because he's still replacing himself when he's played, or if he's checked in the security, then he's netting us 1 card, which is still pretty decent to think about. And then on top of that, he even has a nice main ability where when your opponent has 8 or more cards in their hand, you may suspend this tamer to unsuspend one of your Digimon with Gaomon in its name. So the whole idea is to make sure that your opponent has as many cards as possible, or at least 8 cards. You're not trying to force them to draw, but that's where the bounce effects kind of come in to just help them get to that 8 count. So that way we could make Thomas's ability online to just be able to unsuspend our Mirage Gaugamon. And Mirage Gaugamon has unblockable, so that means multi-attacking potential with Mirage Gaugamon is very, very powerful just because, again, his unblockable ability allows us to bypass blockers, making it that much easier to close out the game with. But the fact that we could utilize this with some of our other Gaomons to just be aggressive with them if we need to is also another very decent line of play that we could think about doing. So, like I said before, Mirage Gaugamon is just a relatively decent generic card that can be doing quite a lot depending on what you support him with. So here's just a whole bunch of different examples of cards you could include to support him or make a new deck out of. So if you wanted to run him in a Turbo Omnimon style of deck, the fact that he digivolves and gains you memory back means that he's going to be a relatively cheap and efficient Digimon to digivolve up into, making it easier to go into Omnimon with if you so feel like, on top of him being another 12k beater for the deck to be playing, just makes him a really decent Digimon for a Turbo Omnimon style. So you could run him like that, and if you are running him as a more Turbo Omnimon style of deck, then of course you still also have access to Plisseomon, which is still just a relatively decent tempo tool. And then you could do some really interesting things with him in All Force or the Veemon package as a whole, just because All Force is tamer-based, Mirage Gaugamon has a good tamer, and even though the tamer isn't supporting All Force, the fact that it is a blue tamer that does have the potential of resting himself means that All Force could utilize that to get an extra attack off of, or you could utilize a lot of the All Force cards in the Gaomon deck just to have that type of package available to Gaomon, because the All Force cards are still pretty decent in their own right. Then, if you wanted to play a little bit more defensively, you could also just run Shakomon and maybe have access to some yellow megas. So you could build some interesting decks out of Shakomon and his potential. And then you also could think about running the promo Weregarurumon, just because the promo Weregarurumon is pretty decent in interacting with the fact that the opponent wants to have 8 or more cards in their hand in order to gain some sort of a benefit. And the benefit off of this card is gaining security attack +1, so that way you could deal more damage. And then on top of which, you could also think about running a couple of Garurumon cards just to act as a bit of more aggression and draw engine. Then, like I said before, you have access to the Veemon package, so if you wanted to, you could double down on Thomas and really utilize Thomas's ability to unsuspend your Gaomons to utilize a card like Ray of Victory that is interacting with the fact that you have Tamers off of his when Digivolved ability, and interacts with Unsuspend synergy by giving the Digimon he digivolves up into jamming. So a Mirage Gaugamon that's unblockable and has jamming is pretty interesting to think about. Then you also have access to some other Veemon package cards, so if you wanted to, you could also think about running Veemon 0, just because, again, Veemon synergy, Tamer synergy, draw engine, all that. You could also think about running Rena, just to try to help dig out for some of your V-base cards, and she also has a nice, generically decent ability where your blue attacking Digimon will gain plus 1000 DP, so you could really double down on the DP boost in this style of deck and make it so that your Mirage Gaugamon is going to be as powerful as possible whenever he swings. And then you also could still think about running more Veemon cards just because you're interacting with blue Tamers because of Thomas. So Veemon that gains jamming is still relatively decent to think about running. And then if you wanted to, you could also run a little bit more jamming package. And you could also run the DemiVeemon that interacts with jamming that helps you draw cards that way. And then to cap off and round out the Veemon package, you could think about running BT02 Veemon, just because the unsuspend synergy is there and he allows you to draw cards for unsuspending. Then you also have access to a couple of really interesting other tech options, so you could run a little bit of a hybrid package where you could utilize something like Strabimon to help dig out your Tamers and help dig out your other hybrid Digimon, even though you're not really going to be utilizing a hybrid top end. Just the fact that he can help dig out your Tamers is already important enough. And then if you wanted to, you could also think about running Gaugamon, just because he is a Gao card, and if you wanted to double down on the draw and digiburst abilities, then he does both. And then if you really didn't feel like running Gorillamon and wanted to run something a little bit more efficient in terms of overall tempo, then you could also run Tobiumon, just because Tobiumon has a really low play cost of 3, where Gorillamon has a play cost of 6. So in the off chance you don't see a rookie, Tobiumon is still a really good card to run, just because, again, we are a little bit lower on the rookie count than a lot of normal decks. So the fact that we might not see our rookies as often as we would like means that sometimes we would need to hard play some of our other cards, and Tobiumon is just a better card to hard play. And then we have some really interesting option cards available to us, so you could also think about utilizing Aqua Viper, just because Aqua Viper is another bounce-based option card, where you return one of your cards to your hand to bounce 2 of the opponent's level 4, and that's 2 cards being added back to the opponent's hand, so you could line up some really powerful lines of play with this. And then he does have his own option card that synergizes more directly with him in the form of Full Moon Blaster, where Full Moon Blaster basically is almost doing the exact same thing as the Ray of Victory, but the big difference is if the opponent has 8 or more cards in their hand, then the card that we would be bouncing is going to go to the bottom of the opponent's deck instead. So if you want a little bit harder of a removal card, then Full Moon Blaster is definitely pretty spicy to think about utilizing. Or if you just want to run the most generic of bounce options, then you also could just run Cocytus Breath, just because this doesn't have any target restrictions, and it's just an overall decent bounce effect. But like I said, Mirage Gaugamon, being as generically decent as he is, means that he has just a whole bunch of flexibility and variety in terms of how you could run him and how you could build his deck. And I definitely think this deck is a really fun and interesting deck to be playing around with. So that's all I really have for this video. As always, I'll have the deck listed down in the description below, and feel free to tell me your thoughts down in the comments below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more content, and I'll see you in the next video.